Imagine for a moment that you could skim through every page of Islam's holy book, the Qur'an. You would encounter the names of countless prophets, kings, and righteous men who shaped the spiritual destiny of humanity. But as your eyes move across those sacred verses, searching for the voices of women, you would discover something extraordinary. Among all the mothers, daughters, wives, and queens who influenced the course of divine history, only one woman's name appears in those holy pages. Not Eve, the mother of all humanity. Not Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Not any of the countless righteous women who walked this earth. Just one name, repeated again and again with a reverence that elevates her above every other woman who ever lived. That name is Mary. But why? What made this young woman so unique that God Himself chose to immortalize her name in the final revelation to mankind? The answer will shake you to your core. The temple walls had witnessed centuries of worship, but they had never seen anything like what was about to unfold within their sacred confines. Ancient stones that had absorbed countless prayers were about to become witnesses to a divine selection so extraordinary that it would echo through eternity. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if creation was holding its breath for what was coming. In a world where women were often invisible in religious texts, where their stories were whispered rather than proclaimed, something unprecedented was about to happen. A young girl was about to be chosen for a destiny so magnificent and terrifying that it would require divine intervention just for her to survive it. Hannah, the wife of Imran, had made a vow that would change the course of history. Her words, spoken in desperation and hope, had reached the highest heavens. She had promised to dedicate her unborn child entirely to God's service, expecting a son who would serve in the temple. But God's plans were infinitely greater than human expectations. When Mary was born, Hannah's heart must have trembled with confusion. How could a daughter fulfill such a sacred vow? Yet, in that moment of apparent disappointment lay the seeds of the most extraordinary story ever told. The Creator of the universe had already chosen this infant girl for something beyond Hannah's wildest imagination. The rejection she feared would become the selection that would elevate her daughter above every woman in history. The temple priest faced an unprecedented dilemma when Hannah arrived with her infant daughter. Never before had a female child been offered for dedicated service in their sacred halls. Their traditions, their customs, their very understanding of religious protocol had no framework for this situation. Yet something about this child was different. Each qualified priest would cast his reed pen into the flowing water, and the one whose pen defied the current would be chosen as Mary's guardian. The scene was electric with tension as grown men watched pieces of wood bob and sink in water, knowing that this simple act would determine the course of a destiny beyond their comprehension. Zachariah's reed pen floated against the current, while all others sank, or were swept away. The elderly priest, already advanced in years and blessed with his own miraculous son John, found himself chosen for yet another divine assignment. His weathered hands trembled as he lifted the floating pen from the water, understanding that his life was about to be transformed once again. The other priests could only watch in stunned silence as divine selection manifested before their eyes. This was no coincidence, no random chance. The same God who had blessed Zachariah with a son in his old age was now entrusting him with the care of a child whose future would eclipse even the miracle of his own son's birth. The floating reed pen had become a bridge between two miracles. The upper chamber of the temple became Mary's sanctuary, a sacred space where the impossible became routine. Here, far from the eyes of ordinary worshippers, Mary grew in grace and wisdom under Zachariah's careful guidance. But her guardians soon discovered that he was not her only provider. Each time he climbed the narrow stairs to check on his young charge, he found her surrounded by provisions that no human hand had placed there. Fresh fruits in seasons when they did not grow, pure water in vessels that had been empty, sustenance that appeared as mysteriously as morning dew. The sight never failed to send shivers through his aged frame. He was witnessing daily miracles in the care of a child who seemed to live at the intersection of heaven and earth. The questions burned in Zachariah's mind each time he discovered these impossible provisions. His lips would form the words before his wisdom could stop them. "Oh Mary, from where does this come to you?" The inquiry was natural, human, necessary. How could an elderly priest process the reality that his young charge was being fed by invisible hands? That the laws of nature bent themselves around her needs? Mary's response was as profound as it was simple, revealing a spiritual maturity that transcended her tender years. She understood that her sustenance came from a source beyond human comprehension, from the one who provides for all creation without limit or condition. Her faith was not learned but innate, not developed but divinely implanted. The other temple servants began to notice the unusual activity surrounding Mary's chamber. Whispered conversations carried hints of the miraculous provisions, of the child who needed no earthly caretaker because heaven itself attended to her needs. Some watched with wonder, others with growing unease. The established order of religious life was being quietly revolutionized by the presence of one small girl. The very foundations of their understanding were shifting beneath their feet. If God could provide for this child in ways that defied explanation, what else might He choose to do that challenged their carefully constructed beliefs? The temple had become a place where the impossible was learning to feel at home. As Mary grew from child to young woman, the signs of her divine selection became more pronounced, more undeniable. Her devotion to prayer was unlike anything the priests had witnessed. She could spend hours in prostration, lost in communion with her Creator, her young face glowing with an inner light that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Her understanding of Scripture surpassed that of scholars twice her age. Her character was unmarked by the petty jealousies and worldly concerns that troubled other young people. She moved through the temple like a living prayer, her very presence sanctifying the spaces she occupied. Every day brought new confirmation that this was no ordinary girl, but someone chosen for an extraordinary purpose. The foreshadowing of her ultimate destiny began to manifest in subtle ways that only later would be understood as divine preparation. Mary's prayers took on an intensity that seemed to shake the very walls of the temple. Her prostrations lasted longer, her tears of devotion flowed more freely, her communion with the divine grew deeper and more profound. She was being prepared for something that would require every ounce of spiritual strength she could muster. The quiet years in the temple were not merely about growing up. They were about growing into a vessel capable of containing the greatest miracle in human history. Each prayer, each moment of devotion, each display of unwavering faith was strengthening her for the moment when the impossible would come knocking at her door. Years had passed since Mary first entered the temple sanctuary, and now she stood at the threshold between girlhood and womanhood, her beauty radiating with the inner light of someone touched by divine grace. The whispers among the temple workers had grown more frequent as they witnessed her extraordinary devotion and the continuing mysterious provisions that appeared in her chamber. The eastern chamber of the temple had always been Mary's preferred sanctuary for the most intimate moments of worship. Behind a curtain that separated the most sacred areas of the temple from the general worship spaces, Mary found the perfect isolation she sought. The filtered light created an atmosphere of ethereal beauty, and the silence here was so profound it seemed to pulse with its own life. She arranged her prayer covering carefully and sank to her knees, then prostrated herself completely on the cool stone floor. Her heart poured out in wordless devotion, her spirit soaring in praise and surrender to the one who had blessed her beyond measure. The air around her seemed to thicken with expectation, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her breath catch. Forces beyond the physical realm were converging on this sacred moment, preparing to shatter the boundaries between heaven and earth. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came as a shift in the very fabric of reality around Mary. The air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone, and a presence of indescribable magnitude filled the chamber. Mary's prayers caught in her throat as she sensed she was no longer alone, that something of tremendous power had entered her sacred space. When she lifted her head and opened her eyes, the sight that greeted her defied every law of nature she had ever known. Standing before her was a figure of such radiant perfection that her human vision struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. This being seemed to be crafted from pure light itself, tall and magnificent, with an aura of authority that made the very walls seem to bend in reverence. Terror crashed over Mary like a devastating wave, sweeping away every ounce of the peace she had been experiencing moments before. Her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably as she stared at this otherworldly visitor whose very presence seemed to burn through the air between them. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, to escape this overwhelming encounter with something that belonged to realms far beyond human understanding. Her voice, when she finally managed to speak, was barely a whisper choked with fear and desperation. She called upon the protection of Rahman, the most merciful, seeking refuge in the divine mercy that had always been her sanctuary. The being before her was too magnificent, too powerful, too utterly foreign to her mortal experience, and she felt certain that witnessing such glory would destroy her. The angel's response came with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such an awe-inspiring being, his voice carrying warmth and compassion that immediately began to ease the terror gripping Mary's heart. He spoke words of peace and comfort, identifying himself not as a threat to be feared but as a messenger sent by the Most High. His presence, though still overwhelming, began to feel less like impending destruction and more like protective strength. Yet even as he sought to calm her fears, his next words would transform her terror into something far more complex and challenging. He spoke of coming to bestow upon her a gift of unimaginable purity and significance, a blessing that would elevate her above every woman who had ever lived. The mysterious language he used made her heart race with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The angel's declaration struck Mary like lightning splitting the night sky in two. He was announcing that she, a virgin dedicated to God's service, would conceive and bear a son whose very existence would redefine humanity's relationship with the divine. This child would not be merely human but would carry within himself the breath of God, the Word made flesh, a living miracle that would serve as the ultimate sign to all mankind. Mary's response erupted from her lips with the raw honesty that had always characterized her relationship with her Creator. She was not challenging the angel's authority or questioning God's infinite power, but simply voicing the biological impossibility that any rational person would recognize. How could she, who had never known the touch of a man, whose purity was both her pride and her offering to the Almighty, possibly conceive a child? Mary would conceive not through human means but through divine fiat, her womb becoming the sacred vessel for a miracle that would demonstrate to all creation that nothing was impossible for the one who had spoken the universe into being with a single word. The child she would carry would be living proof that the Creator's power transcended every limitation that confined human understanding and experience. As the angel's words settled into Mary's consciousness like seeds of light taking root in fertile ground, something miraculous began to occur within her young body. Without physical touch, without earthly intervention, without any of the natural processes that typically brought new life into being, the greatest miracle in human history began to unfold. The Spirit of God breathed into her womb, and conception occurred through pure divine command. Mary felt the change instantly, a profound transformation that told her beyond any doubt that the impossible had just become reality. Her hands moved instinctively to rest upon her belly, where the Word of God was now taking human form. The angel's announcement had not been mere words but divine decree backed by the infinite power of creation itself. The weight of what had just occurred pressed down upon Mary's slight frame like the responsibility of carrying the entire world upon her shoulders. In the span of a few heartbeats, she had been transformed from Mary the temple servant into Mary the chosen vessel, from a young woman living in peaceful obscurity to the central figure in the most significant event in human history. The child now growing within her was not just any child but the Messiah himself, the one for whom generations had waited, the ultimate sign of God's mercy to mankind. The responsibility was staggering, the implications terrifying, the future completely uncertain. How would she explain to anyone what had just happened? Who would believe such an impossible story? How would she bear not only a child but the weight of carrying God's greatest gift to humanity? The angel's departure left Mary alone with the most momentous secret in the history of creation. The silence that had once brought her such peace now felt heavy with the magnitude of what she carried both in her womb and in her heart. She remained prostrate on the chamber floor long after the celestial messenger had vanished, her mind struggling to process the complete transformation that had just occurred in her life. The sacred child growing within her was not merely the product of miraculous conception, but the very Word of God taking flesh, divine mercy clothed in human form. Every breath she drew now sustained two lives, one purely human and one that bridged the gap between earth and heaven. The awesome responsibility of nurturing God's ultimate revelation to mankind had become her sacred trust. When Mary finally rose from the floor, her legs trembling beneath her like a newborn fawn taking its first steps, she understood that her life of quiet devotion in the temple sanctuary was about to end forever. The months ahead would test every fiber of her faith, challenge her courage in ways that would either shatter her completely or forge her into something extraordinary beyond human imagination. She was about to learn what it truly meant to trust in God's plan when the entire world would question her integrity, doubt her story, and challenge her character with accusations that would cut deeper than any physical wound. But in that sacred moment, still growing with the after effects of angelic visitation and divine miracle, Mary made a choice that will echo through eternity. She would place her complete trust in Allah's wisdom of cost to herself. The pain reached unbearable levels as Mary stumbled toward what appeared to be a date palm tree rising from the barren landscape like a sentinel posted by divine providence. But as she drew closer, her heart sank in despair at the sight that greeted her. The tree was completely withered, its branches bare and lifeless, offering neither shade nor sustenance to a woman in desperate need of both. This bitter discovery felt like the final cruel blow in a series of trials that had already pushed her beyond her limits of endurance life. Mary held her son against her breast, marveling at the perfect features that somehow reflected both her own humanity and something infinitely greater that she could not name, but instinctively recognized as sacred. The overwhelming mixture of relief, exhaustion, and wonder that flooded through Mary as she held her miraculous child was tempered by the growing realization of what awaited them both when they returned to the world of human judgment and accusation. The wilderness had provided sanctuary for the birth, but it could not shelter them forever from the questions, doubts, and condemnation that would greet their return. How could she possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe that this perfect child had been conceived through divine command rather than human transgression? The voice that had comforted her during labor had promised that Allah would provide the means for her vindication, but Mary could not imagine how any earthly power could convince a skeptical world to accept such an impossible truth. The child in her arms was living proof of God's infinite power, but to everyone else, he would appear to be evidence of her supposed shame. As Mary prepared to leave the miraculous oasis that had sheltered her son's birth, she understood that the greatest test of her faith still lay ahead. The wilderness journey had been physically demanding, but the return to human society would challenge every aspect of her character, her courage, and her trust in divine providence. She would face accusation, condemnation, and quite possibly death, carrying with her only the promise that God would not abandon those who trusted completely in His plan. The child sleeping peacefully in her arms held within himself the power to speak truth that would silence every accuser, but that moment had not yet come. For now, Mary had only her faith, her love for her miraculous son, and the unshakable conviction that the one who had provided dates and water in the wilderness would also provide the means for her vindication when the time was right. The journey back toward civilization was a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, as Mary carried in her arms the answer to humanity's deepest longings while simultaneously bearing what appeared to be the evidence of her own disgrace. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation that would either destroy her completely or establish her as one of the most honored women in all of human history. The child she carried would soon reveal himself as far more than any ordinary baby, but until that moment of divine revelation, Mary would have to endure whatever trials awaited her with nothing but faith as her shield and trust as her weapon. The greatest miracle in human history was about to face its first test in the court of human opinion, and the outcome would determine not just Mary's fate but the course of spiritual history for all mankind.